Hi, this is Jonathan Lehman, and welcome to this episode of 9 Marks Pastors Talk. 9 Marks exists to help pastors build healthy churches. Learn more at 9marks.org. Or if you feel like helping to give, go to 9marks.org/talk. Today, I'm having a conversation with Samuel James. Samuel is an editor at Crossway. What's your official title?
I'm now Director of Content Development.
Okay, and he does a good job directing such content development. I've been in his hands for some of the content I helped put together, and this brother was helpful to me and improved the work I was doing, and so I'm grateful for him. He wrote a great book called Digital Liturgies, and also has a blog column by that same title, or a Substack column by that,
Yeah.
and I'd encourage you to read it. And what I want to do with him today is actually just walk through a recent article back in February 2025 he wrote called "Does Maturity Still Matter?" We don't typically do pastors' talks this way. I'm just going to work through this article, Samuel, with you. And have you ever listened to Al Mohler interview people, like on Thinking in Public?
Sure, yeah.
Have you ever noticed he doesn't ask questions? He says something and then pauses and waits for you to respond.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I'm always like, Al, ask a question.
Yeah. Everyone's got their own style.
They sure do. I was on that with him once, and I was like, I kept waiting for a question, and there'd be this long pause. I'm like, oh wait, I'm supposed to start talking now, aren't I? Well, I'm going to do that to you.
Okay.
And,
thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, that's right. I want to think about that in the context. Everything in this article, does maturity still matter? In the context of the church, you begin. Well, how would you sum up the article as a whole? What was your goal in the article as a whole?
Yeah, my goal in the article was, at the time I wrote it, I had been reading a book called A Non-Anxious Presence by Mark Sayers. And part of the book, A Non-Anxious Presence, is Mark Sayers talking about leadership and how institutions, networks, that's a preferred word in the book, can kind of become held hostage by a level of immaturity in the network or in the institution, so that leaders spend a disproportionate amount of their time trying to manage the issues caused by the immaturity. Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of apply that a little bit more broadly to what I think are some live issues in Christian life, specifically in American evangelicalism, where there's partly because of the digital age and partly for some other reasons, there is a kind of an ambient feeling that the traditional markers of maturity, things like careful thought, calm decision-making, the ability to admit when you're wrong, those don't matter as much, because the goal is to win. The goal is to kind of accomplish whatever you're seeking, whether that's ecclesiological, political, whatever.
The incentive structure of the algorithm.
Right, yeah, whether it's pure attention-based. So I wanted to kind of ask those hard questions of us as Christians, kind of in an American evangelical context, and to kind of remind myself and remind others that simply because the technology has advanced and simply because the stakes are high in many cases, that does not mean that these traditional virtues are obsolete.
First of all, I love the title of Sayers' book, A Non-Anxious Presence, right? That's just it's a non-anxious presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about my own role in the home, for instance, and children's emotions might be going crazy. What do they need from me? They need a high, shrill response? No, they need me to be a non-anxious presence. Or context of a church members meeting. Do they need the elders or pastors to be deeply emotional? No, they need a non-anxious presence. So just that very phrase is speaking in helpful ways. Here's something that this is you quoting Sayers. As a network, or could we just say an organization, is swamped by chronic anxiety, it is marked by reactivity. So everybody's just reacting. Those within the system no longer act rationally, but rather high emotion becomes the dominant form of interaction. The system's focus is directed toward the most emotionally immature and reactive members. Can you explain that? Why In an anxious reactive system in which high emotion is dominant, what role, why is everything focused to the most emotionally immature and reactive members?
Yeah, I think what Sayers is getting at there is, if you spend a lot of time in institutional life, whether that's just part of a local church or whether you're part of your workplace or something, everyone has kind of been in a meeting where the meeting just went sideways. And the original purpose of the meeting was kind of lost in the conversation that ensued. So maybe someone felt stepped on, maybe someone was put out by the process or something like that. We've almost pretty much all of us have some kind of story about a church business meeting where the original purpose of the meeting is completely lost, because essentially what you're doing at that point is you're trying to kind of limit the collateral damage from this more relational kind of to use his word, anxiousness that's going on. And so I think that he's applying that kind of at an institutional level to say, the more stressed that an institution is, the more unclear about its purpose, the more kind of unsure about what its role is and how it gets there, then essentially its eyes drop. We talk about in sports, like the quarterback's eyes dropping to look at the pressure instead of trying to find the open receiver. The eyes drop in an institution to kind of look at, okay, who's upset? Who is saying things? Who's complaining?
What can I do to fix it?
What can I do to fix it? And so when your eyes drop like that, essentially your attention is being taken off this kind of confident forward progress as an institution. It's taken off that kind of thinking ahead and problem solving, and it's simply trying to get everybody to not be at each other's throats. So I think in my reading of Sayers, he's kind of taking that Edwin Friedman dynamic that Edwin Friedman talks about in A Failure of Nerve, and kind of applying it to Christian institutions in particular.
Those who are more mature and healthy begin to adapt their behavior to appease the most irrational and unhealthy. This creates a scenario where the most emotionally unhealthy and immature members in the group become de facto leaders, shaping the emotional landscape with the focus of their negative behavior and what they see as the negative behaviors of others. And then you go on to say this creates a reactive fire extinguishing mode. So you're just trying to put out fires all the time. But then, and here's where it also gets interesting, you keep using this language of maturity and immaturity. It seems to me we need to seriously consider the possibility that the spiritual maturity and spiritual effectiveness of movements and organizations are deeply connected. Explain that. How are the spiritual maturity, let's say, of a church, and the spiritual effectiveness of that church are deeply connected?
Well, I think maturity is measured by the biblical virtues. So humility, confidence, trust, faith in God, faith in his purposes, the ability to love well despite disagreement, the ability to shepherd and disciple people. And so those are kind of the marks of maturity of a Christian and of a church. I think what happens is if a church or an organization is becoming dominated by immaturity through some immature members, then the institution is always in a perpetual crisis mode. The church is always trying to figure out what can we do to put out this fire to placate these people. My dad was a pastor for more than 20 years.
All growing up, right?
Yeah,
for you? You grew up in
pretty much all growing up. Yeah, he was a pastor for many years. And this dynamic was very evident because the worst thing that could ever happen for a lot of the people that he was pastoring was that somebody would leave the church. Like that was the one thing that absolutely could not happen. And so whatever decision had to be made, it had to be made in a way that would not lead this person to leaving the church, because that was considered an unmitigated disaster no matter
Failure.
what the circumstances.
Yeah.
And so what that would do in the culture of the church is it would empower people to disregard biblical standards, to do things that were not in keeping with being a Christian, not being in keeping with being a member of the church. And because eventually, like parenting, when the child takes control of the house through passive parenting, the child starts to understand that he has that control. He starts to realize, oh, I can get away with this because they haven't done anything about this in the past. And what that does at an institutional level is it just locks down anything the institution wants to do, because eventually you're going to have to face the fact that immature people make the wrong decisions. They can't be trusted with authority. They can't be trusted to carry out what you're wanting them to do. So immaturity locks down the institution.
To use your earlier language, when the eyes drop and I preoccupy myself with pacifying the immature in the congregation, that actually turns into a kind of incentive or reward structure.
Right.
Of, oh, my voice can be heard.
Right.
I can make a difference. I'm going to keep doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, I have mature people in the church are saying, I don't really know what to do here or something.
Yeah. I have a friend who tells an amazing story about a particular author that he had a conversation with. And this author had kind of pivoted her particular platform to becoming very kind of loud and abrasive and sounding the alarm about everything. And my friend, asked, like, your earlier work wasn't like this. Like, what inspired the change? And she said, well, no one listened to me while I was being careful and being thoughtful and being,
nuanced.
But as soon as I started saying, if you do this or if you do that, you're an abuser or you hate women or something. As soon as she started doing that, she told my friend this, people started paying her attention.
Yeah.
And so,
Wow.
that's a lesson that every child learns, that, the tantrum can work.
Produces results.
The anger can get the attention. And if leaders are responsive to that by placating it, then people have become de facto leaders.
Who was that author, did you say?
Do you want me to say?
No, I don't.
Okay. I wanted to pass the test, but I wasn't sure.
I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Okay, so to think about the context of a life of a church, let's bullet point a few sources of immaturity. So to the pastor listening, as it were, you are contributing to the immaturity of your church if you, what? Let's give some bullet points here. What do pastors do that contribute to this problem?
For pastors?
Yeah. I've got a list of 3 that I jotted down, but thought I'd start with you.
Well, first of all, I want to get it on the record that for me, this is entirely hypothetical because my pastors are perfectly mature people. And so I'm just having to imagine immaturity on their behalf. I just want that on the record, by the way. No, I can fall into is, I got to be careful how I say this because I want to be precise. Kind of helping to create kind of a unspoken inner circle. And the inner circle is kind of natural. Like, you're going to have friends who are closer. You're going to have people in the church that you feel closer to than others. And that's natural and unavoidable in one sense. But I do think one thing that can happen is that pastors can kind of the friend enemy radar can kind of turn on and stay on in a way that, if you're helpful to me in kind of affirming my decisions, in kind of standing behind me, then you're going to be kind of part of this informal inner circle, and everybody else can kind of stay on the outside. And that tends to foment distrust in the church, where people can kind of see, like the pastor or the pastoral staff, like they have kind of their own little tribe there, and we don't feel welcome. Our voices don't feel heard in that situation. So I think that's maybe one way. Another way is just passivity. When there's clearly issues, a lot of pastors have a lot to deal with. I'm very sympathetic. My father was a pastor. Both of my brother-in-laws are pastor. I'm a man among pastors. And so I understand the pressures of that. But I think with that pressure comes the temptation to simply say, hey, I know this member is is popping off online and is saying things that would damage the reputation of this church if he were to ever, say that his church is our church. But look, I don't really know what to say. I don't really know what authority I have in his life. I'm not going to really disciple that because I'm afraid of it blowing up more than I'm afraid of his spiritual trajectory, which might be affected.
Okay, I think both of those things are insightful. I had three things I wrote down, kind of taking from your article, that pastors do to contribute, and tell me what you think. One, a lack of discipline, right? If you don't, and defining discipline as correcting sin, I can do that privately. I can finally do that publicly. A lack of correcting of sin, correcting of immaturity, and sometimes even removing members from the church, right? Surely foments this kind of immaturity.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the book of Proverbs, right? What happens to the child who's not disciplined?
Right.
Immaturity reigns when we don't discipline our kids, and so in the church, if we don't practice corrective church discipline, I think immaturity is bound to increasingly typify the congregation. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a vicious cycle because, as a pastor or a parent, becomes okay with immaturity among his members, then he himself becomes immature, and then his own immaturity is filtered down to the rest of the church. So that it becomes a vicious cycle where the immaturity that started maybe from a particular member has now kind of spread throughout the entire church, and now they're kind of seeing that immature response modeled in their leadership, and that is in itself is a teacher to the rest of the congregation, just like the passivity of a parent is a teacher to the child.
Yeah, that's right. And leaders who can't be corrected themselves, teach their congregations an inability to be corrected. Yeah. And the whole cycle, as you say, continues. The second thing that occurred to me, and this is from a sentence of yours, later in the article, you write, "We fail when we fixate on someone's passion and earnestness to the exclusion of thinking about their maturity." In other words, we reward the wrong things. We reward the young man who's a passionate preacher. Like, hey, let's get him up in front of the youth group. Or we pick music that just highlights emotion more than anything in this kind of a motivistic environment that other people have written about, from Alistair McIntyre on. When emotion and the emotional state, when authenticity and sincerity become the hallmarks of maturity, or receive the reward, oh, he's really authentic. Yeah. Then these other things of truth, the fruits of the Spirit, as you were talking about, are disincentivized, and heavy emotion becomes what we're holding up, and pretty soon the church is characterized by that and little more.
Yeah, very very often maturity is not loud. So I always get amused because every 6 months or so somebody on social media will post something like, I'm tired of hearing about all the celebrity pastors. I just want to hear stories about all the obscure pastors working in, random places. And I'm thinking, well, we would all like to hear that, but by definition, we're not. Because if we were hearing those stories, they wouldn't be obscure pastors anymore. The essence of maturity, I think, is not necessarily an intrinsic obscurity, but a willingness to be obscure. It's a willingness to be the kind of things that the Lord calls us to be and to do, even if there are no public rewards for that. That's maturity in a nutshell, being willing to do the right thing, even though nobody is actively applauding you. And so I think one of the temptations that I've talked about a lot, and people who listen to me or read me are probably tired of hearing about it, but with pastors, there's always a temptation to kind of compensate for small parish ministry that makes you feel like you're stuck in your own corner of the world by using the internet by using your X account or your blog or your online voice. And what you do is you become a quote unquote public theologian through your online platform, and that side of what you do is actually what energizes you. It energizes you far more than those hospital visits, than those business meetings, than those Sunday night prayer meetings. What really energizes you is to post that devastating takedown, or to kind of keep tabs on that big ministry that you think has gone astray. And it's not that those things never have a place. I don't have anything against pastors writing or using the internet to communicate, certainly. But I do think it's a temptation for pastors to say, hey, what I want is to kind of show how good of a thinker I am, how good of a leader I am. And the people in my little slice of the kingdom, the people in my church, that's not satisfying enough to me to feel validated.
Social media offers an immediate, unfiltered, unedited ability to be amplified. And as you say, insofar as immature, severe, strident, shrill voices receive immediate attention, because we all gasp and say, "Can you believe he just said?" Or, "Man, I'm glad somebody finally said it." Is it fair to say, am I being too cynical to say it's the perfect platform for the immature to flourish?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's, if you were to invent a technology to kind of keep people from growing as people, I don't think you could invent anything better than the internet.
Now, people are going to. You work for a publisher. I work for 9 Marks. People are going to be like, "Okay, that's just elitism talking." True,
right? No, I don't think so.
Right?
I think not to say that I don't have any elitism in my body whatsoever, but I think it's simply the case that, well, okay, I'll use a somewhat cheesy example, but hopefully it'll help. So David's ministry in his first several years of adult life was to be a shepherd. And we hear kind of the low status of that in one of his brothers when he goes to the battlefield, and his brother says, "With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" The contempt just kind of dripping off that question. It's like, in other words, you're insignificant. You're not, all you've experienced is just being a shepherd. You're not ready for this moment. But actually, in the conversation that David has with Saul before he faces Goliath, he says, "Look, I have delivered my sheep from the hand of the lion and the mouth of the bear, and because the Lord gave me success, and that has prepared me through confidence in God to embrace this moment." The reality is that usually, not always, but usually, the deepest moments of maturity and going deep with Christ are going to happen when 99% of people can't see what's going on. When the people in your church can't, identify exactly what's going on. Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's somebody else, but oftentimes the Lord uses those extended seasons of what seems like obscurity to really, really shape us, because the love of man is such a powerful retardant to spiritual growth. It's what Jesus says when he's talking to the Pharisees. He says, "How can you believe when you receive praise from one another and not the praise that comes from the only God?" So in the sense that the internet has kind of given everyone their own sitcom, or given everyone their own TV station, and kind of created this almost celebrityification of ordinary people, I think it has presented unique challenges to maturity.
Well, two things about maturity that occur to me. One, the posture of faith requires a kind of maturity, rather than living by faith. It requires a kind of maturity over and against living by sight. And that's true, number two, because something that occurs to me that goes right to the heart of maturity versus immaturity is immaturity looks for immediate feedback. It has very short time horizons. So think of the toddler in the high chair screaming because she doesn't get the food. That toddler can see about 15 seconds into the future. Whereas
Right.
by the time you get to age 5 or 6, you're waiting around for Christmas. You're really excited. You can see a few days, few weeks into the
Right.
future. When you get into teenage years in high school, you're working for college, so you can see 3, 4 years into the future. When you're hopefully in your 30s, you're thinking about retirement, so you're thinking decades into the
Right.
future. Which is to say, maturity allows for increasing time horizons, right?
Yeah.
Ideally. And what the social media does is it incentivizes instantaneous feedback. And frankly, we all like instantaneous. I like putting the spoon to my mouth and it tastes good. Like we all
Yeah.
like instantaneous affirmation and feedback. But maturity and living by faith means elongating those time horizons. So now as a Christian, I'm living for eternity,
Yeah.
kind of the
Yeah.
longest time horizon of all, which of course what the Lord Jesus exemplifies perfectly is the most, you might say, most mature one.
That's right.
And it's easy to be immature on social media.
Yeah. The Christian writer Alan Jacobs calls it temporal bandwidth. And I love that term. So the idea basically to live your life and to have a perspective that is not limited to right now. So there's a word that we've kind of coined called presentism. Basically, it's just kind of being locked into whatever is current. And that is life on the algorithm. So like you click refresh and you get an entirely new page of stuff every second. That's where you're going to live. I mean, there's just no way around it. And one of the things that has struck me in reading scripture lately has been how the Lord operates in centuries or millennia. The pattern of redemption, the story of redemption takes place over so many years. And it's the Lord's timeline of what considers success and what bears fruit is just far, far different than kind of this immediacy that is in the human heart, to be sure. It's not invented by technology. It's intrinsic to what it means to be people, but it's made infinitely more intense by just the ability we have to click a button and receive praise or be entertained or something like that.
Back to the question of what pastors do to cultivate immaturity as opposed to maturity. You listed a couple of things. I listed a couple of things like lack of discipline, rewarding the wrong things. And then the last thing that occurs to me is, and again, I'm getting this from a sentence of yours on the very last page of this article. Or not page, I printed it out, but this the last paragraph of your internet article, you say it's too easy, even for pastors and theologians who eschew pragmatism, to become awestruck by what a loud personality can seem to accomplish. And that word pragmatism struck me, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm just going to sound very predictably 9 marks right now, okay? Can I do that?
Sure.
Just play to type. What pragmatism does is, again, it incentivizes short-term time horizons.
Yeah.
I think, as opposed to because I'm looking for what, quote unquote, what works. Okay, when I do the altar call this way, or when I put the program this way, or whatever it is, I'm seeing immediate results that I can count, numbers that I can count, and I'm putting my faith, my hope for building this church, leading this church in those immediate results, as opposed to, again, living by faith, ordinary means of grace. You mentioned that at one point in the article, the significance of that. Ordinary means of grace means I'm, again, working for the unseen rather than the seen. I mean, to really get myself in trouble here, Samuel, is it possible that Calvinism in some way helps yield a kind of maturity and anti-Calvinism insofar as it's given to, and I'm certainly not saying all Calvinists are mature. They're not. And I'm certainly not saying all non-Calvinists are immature. I'm not saying that. I am saying a theological system in which we are required to trust in the sovereignty of God,
right,
can, among many other factors of life, can help to yield a long-term eternal mindedness and trust in the unseen that an overemphasis on human I want to emphasize human responsibility, but let's just say an overemphasis on human responsibility and manufacturing immediate outcomes, that revivalism, a Finney-esque revivalism can succumb to, leads to the immaturity of, well, hey, he's really passionate. Hey, let's have him preach. He's charismatic. She's got a beautiful voice and sings with so much. Let's reward that. That insofar as I'm leaning into outcomes that we can quote unquote manufacture, by virtue of our imbalance, I would say, of
Mhm.
divine sovereignty and human responsibility, leaning too hard and far into the human responsibility side, we are actually raising up churches that can be immature over
Mhm.
time. And
Mhm.
so if you're looking at evangelicalism over the last 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, leaning into the revivalistic methodologies, we're leaning into consumerism, we're leaning into emotion as opposed to ordinary means of grace, can yield a generation of immaturity within churches that
Mhm.
are beset to some extent by the rivalries and the factions and the wars and the immaturity that pastors end up having to go back right where we began, lowering our eyes, dropping our eyes to.
Mhm.
So these are some of the thoughts as I was reading through your article. I'm like, okay, this is a big deal. Am,
Yeah.
am I going
Yeah.
off the deep end here?
No, I don't think so. There's a famous little aphorism that is may have probably not literally true, but I think it can be helpful. We ought to work like an Arminian and rest like a Calvinist. You
Hmm.
know, I
Oh, I
think
like it.
I think there's an important nugget of truth there.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think there's a lot of Calvinists who get that backward, at least, and
Hmm.
they work like Calvinists in the sense that there's a lot of lip service given to the doctrines of grace and the idea of sovereignty of God, but they rest like an Arminian. The restlessness is evident in not necessarily the theological vocabulary that they use, but the choices that they make and the way they spend their time. I do think that if you think that the Lord, well, even more specifically than being sovereign, if you think that the Lord is good on his promises and will fulfill everything he has promised to you personally and to his people throughout time, if you really believe that, I do think that has a powerful maturing and slowing effect. Because I think when we get harried, when we have an anxious presence instead of a non-anxious presence,
Hmm.
it's generally when we think, okay, unless this happens right now, then I'm not gonna reap the benefits of this. Our family's gonna be lost. Our church is gonna be lost. This has to happen right now. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, what has the Lord promised? Let's steel ourselves in what He's actually promised to do for us. And that's not to deny that sometimes there are urgent changes that need to be made. Sometimes there are urgent choices. But my experience in only 36 some odd years of being alive has been that most of the spiritual maturity that I've experienced over the years has not come from big urgent changes, but from the accumulation of many small non-urgent changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Why don't we use the language of maturity and immaturity anymore? Why are those
Mm.
verboten categories, politically incorrect categories? Because they just feel condemning, because we don't do that, because we're inclusive, because who are you to
Mm.
say? Like, why? Why don't we use those categories anymore?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to just kind of spitball because I think that's worth taking some more time to chew on. I wonder if part of it is, we're kind of in a move fast and break things society. That was Mark Zuckerberg's big tagline when he was starting Facebook. And, there's something about the word maturity or the word immaturity that kind of implies a slowness, kind of implies this kind of deliberate activity. And I think for a lot of people in a technological age, anything that kind of stops or slows down efficiency is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so the categories of immaturity and maturity have kind of given way to categories of creativity or innovation or efficiency. And so those are
Which
words that
love
are
speed.
or speed. And those are words that are taken from, see, maturity and immaturity, those are words that are rooted in nature because a tree is mature or immature. Living beings are immature or mature. efficiency, speed, innovation, those are the words of industry. Those are the words of technological industry. And so this is part and parcel of the way we as a society are reimagining humanity and reality as more like technology and less in connected with the nature.
But
The natural world.
if you're not careful there, you could sound anti-technology. And if I understand technology as a product of dominion,
Yeah.
right, in some sense, Adamic dominion, I want to say technology as an extension of human work, as the product of human dominion. Technology is a good thing. Obviously, it can
Yeah.
be used for post fall, but is a good thing. But it almost sounds like you're saying technology yields immaturity because it yields shortened time horizons.
I think, and this won't surprise you to hear, but I think technology can have a liturgical effect on us as people, that it kind of conditions us to desire certain things, to not desire certain things, to tolerate certain things and not tolerate others. So where I would situate that in terms of creation is, I would say when God creates Adam, he creates him out of the dirt, and he gives him a commission. He gives him a garden, a temple to steward. And so what matters in terms of Adam is the thing he's made of, which is dirt. So he's part of this world. He's not other than the world, but he's part of it. And this place and these creatures that he has been given to kind of extend the Lord's reign over. Technology is essentially the tools that Adam uses to accomplish that. But technology can never replace the actual sphere of dominion into which he's been placed by the Lord. He can't say, I don't want to live in the garden you've given me. I instead just want to kind of depart and build my own Tower of Babel.
Sure. Well, we can come back to the topic of technology another day.
Okay, sounds good.
I recommended your book at the beginning, Digital Liturgy. I encourage my daughters and church members to read it. Are you working on any books right now?
I am actually. I'm working on a book on technology specifically for teens.
Oh, good. Perfect.
Yeah.
So should I tell my daughters they don't need to read Digital Liturgy and just to wait?
Well, I tell you what, if they enjoy digital liturgies, or if they're in the process of reading it, I might have them be advanced readers on this new manuscript to see if they any feedback they have.
Well, I thought your first book is very readable for teenagers, but I'm glad to hear you're doing another one even more targeted. That's fantastic, and I'm confident it'll be helpful. Brother, thank you for your time. The article, if people want to find it, called "Does Maturity Still Matter?" can be found either on your Substack stack, which I would encourage people to subscribe to. I read it almost every time and am benefited by it. As it can also be found, if they're not subscribed to, at Mere Orthodoxy from May 2023. You just kind of re-upped it on your Substack, if I understand correctly.
That's right. Thank you, brother.
Thanks for your time, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you.
For more articles, books, and podcasts, please visit ninemarks.org.